Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq. Joining me is Ms. Schneider, Partner and Director of Trading at Research and Education with MarketGauge.com to discuss what the potential future trends of infrastructure, healthcare, alternative energy could be as a result of election 2020. Mish, it's great to have you with us. Welcome back to Trade Talks. And as always, I have a laundry list to get through with you. And let's start there with infrastructure, healthcare, alternative energy. They could certainly be back in the spotlight following the final result of the election date. They have often been discussed, but not much has happened in terms of execution. So what do you think is possible for future megatrends there?
Well, before I start, I just want to say thank you, Jill, and great to see you. Thank you for having me back and
You got it.
such an interesting day, no less. Okay, well, what I think we always have to do as investors is not get so caught up on policy and not get so caught up on the politics for sure, but really look more things at from a megatrend standpoint. What is really happening in society at large, not just here in the United States, but over the course of the whole world. So that's where I'm really segueing into alternative energy. And there's no doubt, whether or not you want to go in kicking and screaming, that alternative energy is the future. That's just been proven now as it's become more cost effective and more popular and obviously being used more globally. And so even if one particular party over another is more interested in traditional oil and gas versus alt energy, the investors aren't necessarily going to care. And that's what we really saw even through the last year when all these Robinhood investors came in and started buying up every alternate energy, every clean energy stock there was, and it went crazy until the point, of course, that it got saturated. So I think that the dip that we're seeing as we're coming post-election here in the solars is probably a really good buy opportunity. And I don't like to buy falling knives, but I would look for some kind of a base to be established. Like, for example, if we were looking at Sunrun, which reports this week, if that can hold somewhere around the 60 level, I think that would be a good base. First Solar had huge earnings, spiked and now came off, looking at about 75, 80. So that's how I'm looking at it. I try not to get my head all mixed up by what's happening with the politicos, because ultimately things are going to emerge because they naturally emerge. So that's one.
Yeah, and that's a great point that you make, because at the end of the day, the market's about companies, right? Regardless of who's in the White House, you might have some policy impact on that, but at the end of the day, it's a market of stocks.
Exactly. And also, I mean, let's take a look at, though, another one that really has been a political football and actually is almost a little bit of an embarrassment that we've not been able to get going, and that's infrastructure. The infrastructure in the United States is abysmal compared to some of the Asian infrastructure. And yet, because of gridlock, which we're going into potentially again, whether if Biden wins, we still looks like we're going to have a Republican Senate, even though we're going to have a Democratic House. It's still gridlock. And that has been the thing that has not been able to get passed, even though everybody agrees that we need to have some infrastructure spending happen. So that will be something I'll be keeping another keen eye on. Everybody's talked about it. Doesn't matter what the party affiliation is, and it's desperately needed. So you want to look at the whole infrastructure system, and then whatever companies that would emerge as a result of benefiting from building roads and bridges, faster trains, etc. But again, right now, that's not happening. Another mega trend that we were looking at is, again, with the healthcare, which also will now run into some gridlock once again, because we know that each party looks very differently at the affordable healthcare and whether or not it should be changed. I'm looking at some of the health stocks, but really one of the stocks I'm looking at is a stock that we made a lot of money in and then got a side in and now is basing out again, called eHealth, because it's also hitting another mega trend, which is online shopping. You can go onto eHealth and basically shop for healthcare. And that will actually do all the work for you, number one. It doesn't charge you any money because they make their money from the actual healthcare providers. And also, even though baby boomers aren't necessarily growing in terms of population, there's still a lot of us out there, and you can shop for Medicare very easily on there. So that would be something that I would be looking at. So that's how I'm looking at this, is I'm taking these trends, and then I want to see the companies that are doing the best, that have the best technical setup. And then, of course, once they set up, being able to get in and watching the fervor happen around all these young investors that have really made the market exciting this last year.
Yeah, I would agree with you there. Let's talk about the US dollar for a moment. What's your outlook there as our position in the world has shifted in the past 4 years? And what's your thought on the growing use case of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency in general? Because we've seen a number of mass adoption announcements.
Well, first of all, Bitcoin obviously has become the new popular institutional hedge against inflation, which is really interesting considering it went from the darling to completely poo-pooed and now back to the darling again. And we can see that evidence today. Bitcoin took a big rally. So I think the whole idea of digital currency is on the table, and Lagarde herself actually is now visiting the idea of a digital euro. That will not be good for the dollar. The Chinese government is also looking at a digital yuan, to say it correctly. I've been corrected not saying yuan. And so that too is an issue. But there are other issues for the dollar that we have to look at right here. Part of it, right, is the global perspective of the United States, considering that what's really being displayed around the world is a lack of willingness to get involved with trade, the trade tensions we've had with China, but also with our allies, and then our social unrest, which has hit the waves. Even though it's happening in the world, people think of the United States now as being very divided. They're not altogether wrong. So this all impacts the dollar. But let's put that on the side, because that could change very easily, potentially, with a Biden win. Possibly, allies will feel more encouraged. That could help the dollar. Higher taxes could help the dollar. However, gridlock will probably prevent that from happening. The bigger issue for the dollar, besides the emergence of the digital currencies and the Bitcoin, is what either person who becomes president is going to have to deal with, and that is stagflation. And that is a situation that has emerged because of the pandemic. Because for years and years and years, we had an oversupply of food and a lot of other industrial commodities. And now with the supply chain disruption that we've had given the pandemic, the low labor force that we have given, and the rising demand as people are starting to come back into consumerism, and countries are now shortage of corn and soybeans and wheat and steel and copper, that's going to affect the dollar the most. And that's something we really have to look out for, because we have huge debt, we have low interest rates, and we don't want to see the market go down. So puts the Fed in a little bit of a pickle. What do they do if these rising prices, which we've already seen, just go to the supermarket, right? You see rising prices continue in these raw commodities, and a hoarding mentality continues to emerge. That's going to really negatively impact the dollar, at least for a while, until the Fed has to come in and start raising those rates.
Right. So you were talking about technicals before and the setups that you use. So let's discuss the range for this week and what it sets up for the following. So explain what the strategy is and what you're watching.
Well, this is something that we've researched going back to 1976. So it's got historical significance in that you do a reset based on the week of the actual election. And then whatever the range is, so let's just take Nasdaq, for example. Let's say the low this week was like 265. And so far today, the high has been like 287. And whatever the range winds up being this week, you do a reset next week, starting Monday, so that if it clears those highs, basically that means it's bullish. And if it breaks down under the lows, that means it's bearish. And that really gives you a very simple way of taking this week, throwing out the noise, looking at it completely without any emotion, and just looking at it from a technical perspective. Buyers are going to emerge over the highs, sellers are going to emerge under the lows. And we've looked at this over, like I said, several elections, and it's worked very, very well. And you can look at it as Nasdaq or any of the other individual indices. You can look at it as sector, or you can look at it at a particular instrument. Some of the instruments I'm watching is what I'm really excited about looking, especially those that have been maybe more beat up, that could emerge as we go into 2020, end of 2020, beginning 2021.
All right, and to wrap up here, let's talk about cannabis, which was one of the winners of last night's election. Your thoughts around legalization and legislation?
Well, again, at the federal level, we could see another backstop because of the fact that the federal banking system is still not favorable to this legalization. But yet, from a popular standpoint, we're now almost halfway with states that have legalized it. Arizona I thought was really interesting, Montana, New Jersey. So we had a total of 5 states. I think that cannabis, though, individually could still prosper. And of course, if there's any kind of legislation that passes to make federal banking easier, then the thing could fly. So I'm looking particularly, there's a lot of stocks out there. So that's why I like to wrap it up into an ETF, because it makes it easy to give a recommendation. I'm looking at MJ, very appropriately named as the ETF for cannabis. And if that right now has been sitting and basing right above a 50-day moving average, and if that can clear 1175, whether it be this week you wanted to start, or you just wanted to do exactly what I said, wait for Monday, whatever the high is this week, buy it over the range of that, I would definitely be doing that myself for our clients.
All right, Mish, great to catch up with you as always. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks.
Thank you, Jill. So great to see you.
All right, you got it. And thanks for joining me. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.